Hello, this is Jeff Herman with the Business Journal, and welcome to the webinar, Corona Opening, What Business Owners Need to Know. Today, we're joined by Nils Johnson of Johnson & Johnson Law Firms. They're celebrating their 100th year, and we're thrilled to have Nils's expertise, especially with the recent pandemic and outbreak on the coronavirus, of what business owners really need to know from a legal perspective. So Nils, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome, Jeff. Look forward to it.
So there's a lot, the way there's a new normal, if not a next normal. So would you like to kick us off really and level set where we are as far as the state of affairs?
Yes, this is really, we've been around for 100 years, but this is, the last time this virus swept through the country like this, my grandfather had just got back from the First World War. And we don't have to endure these challenges, thank heavens, very, very often. But the virus has dramatically changed the way that we relate to each other and the way we do business, obviously. 30 million people out of work, 70,000 dead. I look at it in the morning, 72,000 people, 2,200 people died the last 24 hours. Tens of thousands of small shops and schools, businesses, universities, factories, malls, and so forth have been shut down. And it's hard because we're fighting something that is invisible and that is really not well understood yet. There's a lot of psychological damage. I'm sure you would agree as a newspaper editor. We've gone from high prosperity, 3.4% unemployment to, I think they said on the news this morning, it's probably 16 or 17% now. And it's put tremendous pressure on people as individuals and as business owners. We have to worry about job security. Children are out of school. Who's going to babysit?
Right. Elderly
parents, how do we keep our distance from them? My wife and I have a new baby, a grandson, and we're not allowed to hold it. Who's the caregiver if somebody gets sick? And then you have this very unusual tension between generations where young people who apparently are oftentimes asymptomatic and don't get very sick are on the one side of the discussion, and folks who, I'm in my 60s, as we get older, we're more vulnerable to this. So it's a generational thing that's just very unusual. So that's sort of the situation we find ourselves in.
Right, and that generational tension is interesting because the ones that have least impacted health-wise have almost the greater responsibility to not be vectors of transmission.
Right. Of course, they're all going to live forever, and they're not worried about dying. It's just the biology of being young.
Right.
Requires a lot of self-discipline, which unfortunately is not always there. But.
Right. So I know that on March 22nd, could you take us through the changes that started happening? Really, we're deep into, getting into May now, and this has been with us for more than 6 weeks. So what happened around mid-March?
Well, we began to see the goings-on in China, and I began to get concerned in January. I think there was a tendency in the States and around the world to say, well, that's the Chinese problem, particularly from the typical American responses. We're special. It's way over there across the ocean. It's not going to happen to us. There had been several other outbreaks, SARS and so forth, that were bad over there, but never made it to us. So people weren't paying attention, and yet, people are people. Biology is the same whether you're Chinese or Mexican or European. And I began to get pretty concerned by mid-January. I went out end of January, first week of February, and bought masks for my employees. And people thought I was getting the crazy man look from everybody. But I just figured if it's going to happen there at that level, it was coming. And that turns out to have been true. So by, I think, March the 22nd, Ohio was one of the early ones, put an order on through the Department of Health and, of course, our Governor DeWine to stay at home. And so non-essential businesses were told to shut down. And I think the hope was that if the incubation period was, 2 weeks at the outside, that within a month we could, if everybody had good discipline, we could kill the thing off and slowly open back up. So it was pretty successful. The curve was flattened, and we didn't want the infections to spike like that, because you would have overwhelmed the hospital system, as almost was the case in New York, and we were able to flatten things out. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get fewer overall infections, but it means they will be fed into the healthcare system at a pace that can be handled.
Right.
So we have to flatten the curve on the one hand, but on the other hand, you don't want to destroy the economy. And there's a trade-off, and I think the country is fighting to figure out what that balance is right now. So, like I say, it's basically worked. The governor and the Department of Health of Ohio said that manufacturing and construction could open up Monday of this week, May 4th, and that on the 12th, consumer and retail shops can open up. Now, they're not saying let her rip. They're saying open up thoughtfully, and that's some of the things that we're going to talk about in this webinar.
Right.
And there is some hope, I think. Wouldn't you say, Jeff? Remdesivir seems to be this new drug that has some efficacy, maybe shortening the infection or the period of the sickness from 15 days to maybe 10.
Right. But a good job accelerating the approval process to get these drugs tested and to get the efficacy.
Right. But hope is good, and I think that's part of what the president tries to do, is hold some hope out there. But on the other hand, hope is not a policy, and businesses are in a tough spot. There's just no question about it.
Right. I think we've even gotten past this notion of there was such a shock to the system where the numbers are almost hard to fathom, where the talk was always of the V-shaped recovery. Will there be a snapback? But the way it's looking, I mean, things are opening up and there's progress being made, but a pure V, like a snapback like that, with airline travel down to 6% of capacity, and with right. Restaurants and retail still having their challenges around their capacity, I'm not bullish on a pure V-shaped recovery here.
You know, this is so interesting. It's terrible, but at a purely intellectual level, it's sort of interesting, because in China, you wonder, why didn't Beijing get infected? Why didn't Shanghai, these monster big cities, get infected? And it's because their populace and their culture, the populace is much more submissive compared to Americans, who are, you're not going to tell me what to do. I mean, that's our visceral response, and I think it has served us well. But it means, I think, that the thing is going to fester here, because you're always going to have some people. You see it in the protests now, that people want to open and get back. But it's going to be festering away, and one would think that you're going to have some waves, maybe gentler ones, as we move through time. But it's going to be, we got to get a vaccine, and we don't know how long that's going to take.
And to your point, the conflicting messaging we're getting, masks, no masks. I mean, that's been challenging, to say the least.
It has. But for business owners, I think there really are 3 or 4 things that we have to think about, that they have to ask. How do they keep their employees safe? How do they keep their customers safe? How do they show the public what they're doing to keep their employees and the public safe? That's very important. Mm-hmm. And business owners also, most importantly, and this is the topic of our seminar, have to ask, what are my potential liabilities? And so the webinar is going to focus on that last question.
Right, you're right. Those are so keys, is, employee and customer safety, the pure illustration of safety, to go almost over and above, to focus on the fact that this is a safe environment, and then those liabilities associated with it. So yeah, I'm glad we're having this webinar today focused on what are the potential liabilities for business owners as you evolve into this new environment. So, it's something that we owe, right? It's an obligation we have to our customers and to our employees and to the community.
Yes, a business owner has two sets of obligations. First of all, to their customers, and secondly, to their employees. Let's talk about what they have to do, what are their obligations with respect to the general public, to their customers. And to do that, we have to pretend we're in our first year law school class, a negligence class, or a torts class. A tort is something that somebody does to you that's wrong, punches you in the nose, that's a battery. Threatens to punch you in the nose, that's an assault. Breaks into your house, that's theft. So these are torts. These are sort of tickets to court that a plaintiff, somebody with a claim, can use to get into court and to argue about whether you've done something wrong to them. From the standpoint of a business owner, we have to think about what negligence is. And negligence is the violation of a duty to take reasonable care to avoid causing injury or loss to others where it can be foreseen that a particular action or inaction may cause them harm. Foreseeability suggests something that an ordinary person with common sense would expect to happen. Similarly, quote, reasonable care means ordinary precautions, doesn't mean extraordinary. But the greater the potential harm, the greater the ordinary precaution must be. So if something is likely to cause terrible harm, you better take some extraordinary precautions. If something may cause an unfortunate situation, but it's not earth-shaking, okay, not as great an effort need be made. So let me give you a couple examples, if that's okay.
Yeah, because the subjectivity, I'm battling with the subjective language around ordinary, extraordinary, and who's to say what's
Who's to say, exactly. So in law school, we look at situations that have happened in the past that have been litigated. And then we learn not by following a hard and fast rule, but we learn by analogy of things that have happened, claims have been made, cases have been litigated. And so we develop our law in this country in that manner, rather than the Napoleonic system, if you can say, in Europe, where they try to think up a rule for everything in advance. And that's hard, it seems to me. I like our system better. But here's some examples. Say I drive drunk down a crowded, narrow street that's full of pedestrians and cars. Well, it's pretty foreseeable that there's a good chance I'm going to cause some injury, run into another car, run into a pedestrian. Similarly, if I'm a contractor and I'm hired to build a building and I want my margin to increase and I buy cheap materials and cheat, well, it's pretty foreseeable, isn't it, that in time that building may fall down and people would be hurt. So in both situations, either situation, if I'm in a collision with my car, if the building falls down, a jury is going to be easily persuaded that it was my fault because I breached a duty of care. It's our duty. It was pretty obvious. Mm-hmm. But so let's take the second week of law school and think about this in a way that's a little more subtle. I'm not entitled, as an individual with no training, to write the regulations for bridge design, for instance. A government agency, on behalf of all the public that has the experts and so forth, is the one that's going to write the regulations. So assume that the government sets a standard for bridge design, that you have to engineer and build a bridge that's going to last for 50 years. And let's say that the bridge company builds it exactly correctly to those specifications. 75 years from now, if the municipality that owns the bridge had never done any maintenance and the bridge collapses, should the municipality and the public be able to go back to the bridge company, the construction company, and sue them? Probably not. What if 10 years after the bridge was constructed, somebody invents a new super metal? I'm thinking of a Ayn Rand novel. And say the regulations change at that point, and all the bridges that are to be constructed have to be with a new metal. So question, should the original bridge company, the construction company that designed and built the bridge to the regulations that were on the book at that time. Should they have to tear down the bridge and rebuild it? No, that's not the way things work. Let's think about it from another perspective, from the perspective of the people who have to use the bridge and drive across it. Now, maybe we're out in the future, maybe the bridge is really old, but it's on the river, and it's the only bridge for 50 miles. I was working in Kentucky some years ago, and that was exactly the situation. I mean, was working on both sides of the river on a project, and it took, was, a 4-iron away, but if I wanted to go to the other side, it was a 60-mile trip to drive up to the nearest bridge. So maybe the economy's bad. This is out in the future. The motorists, the taxpayers don't want to pay the taxes necessary to replace or repair the bridge. Maybe they're willing to take a risk of driving across it just for a few more years. So who's at fault if the bridge falls down? Is it the driver of the unhappy car that was crossing and fell into the river? How about the taxpayers? How about the municipality? How about the engineer? So these examples suggest that risk must be assessed from many perspectives. I might be willing to take a risk, but you, Jeff, might not, because it depends upon our needs and our motivations. Mm-hmm. So people constantly, we're talking about risk, talking about anticipating risk and what your duty might be as you anticipate risks. People take risks all the time. Naturally, if I never want to get in a car wreck, I just never get in a car, but that's hardly practical. The country has to have motor transportation. Even though literally in my lifetime, hundreds of thousands of people have died from car crashes. So everything carries some sort of risk, and most of these we can assess, and this is an important point, using common sense. If you know about a risk and you can reasonably evaluate it, you may well decide, and we do this all the time, to accept the risk because if the benefits are high enough. So law, we're talking about negligence, has a second concept. It's called assumption of the risk. Mm-hmm. If somebody knowingly undertakes something risky and is injured, it's generally their own damn fault. I'm a skier. If I ski, and this happened, almost happened to me a few years ago, and I cross my skis and I take a header and I break a leg, that's on me. It's not right on the ski company. So you can accept a risk, however, if you don't know about it, or you're not qualified to assess the risk. So to size up some risks, to evaluate some risks, common sense isn't enough. You need help from experts, and that's where we are with the COVID-19 situation. So a business owner in these circumstances with this new unknown risk that's not yet fully understood by the experts, we have to ask, what's the risk to our clients and customers? And unless you're an epidemiologist, you've got to go somewhere else to inquire and make yourself informed from experts. And then you have to ask, what can I do to mitigate, reduce exposure to the virus? And ask, are the steps you're taking in line with the steps that other businesses, maybe your competitors, are taking themselves? Then there's a third concept that we need to understand, which is called standard of care. Mm-hmm. Standard of care is something that is developed through time in a given business, in a given industry. Is there a standard of care that has been developed for your particular business? Now, I'm an attorney. We have a law office. So the first 2 weeks this went on, it was hard. I immediately lost my 2 staff members, our paralegals, to sickness, not knowing whether it was COVID or something else. And from my reading, I said, well, look, it looks like you got to quarantine these people for 2 weeks. So we said, go home, don't come back for 2 weeks. We paid them and so forth. And we began, even within our little 8 or 9 person operation, to develop standard of care. Then at our bar association meetings, we would ask, what are the other firms doing? What do they think is reasonable? So all businesses, I think, have to go through a similar process. We can't know exactly what to do yet, because Nobody understands perfectly the virus. But remember, back there is this idea of, in the negligence law, the greater the risk, and people die from this, the greater the care that has to be observed. So Jeff, got to look to the experts again to tell us about the virus and maybe to give us some direction. And so what do we know about the virus? What does anybody know who's been paying attention? And what are the experts telling us? They say that it's highly infectious, apparently much more so than influenza, that it's probably at least several times as deadly as the flu, at least twice as deadly, maybe 10 times as deadly. Paradoxically, a large percentage of people, particularly young ones, are asymptomatic or only get a very mild form of the disease. So this means people can spread the disease for weeks or even a full week, even if they're going to get sick before they know that they have it. And that makes it tough to defend against. It's spread by droplets. As people sneeze and cough, they're expelling the virus. The experts say shedding the virus. And if you're nearby and breathe it in, you can catch it. They say that wearing a mask is useful. And back to your earlier comment at the beginning, they said, oh, don't wear masks. What they meant was our healthcare providers need the good masks that are available. And then 2 weeks later, it was very confusing. Well, go ahead and wear masks. But I think that's excellent advice.
Yeah, and masks have been positioned as social good. So you wear a mask for their benefit, not for your benefit.
It's a two-way street, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we know that it can be spread on surfaces, but there's not perfect data. Scott Gottlieb, the former head of the FDA, was on the TV this morning saying that we're finding that as the data develop, that most of the spread is within families or people who were on subways and commuter situations where there was a lot of intense interaction. Fresh air and sunshine seem to be a good thing in limiting transmission. We know that immunocompromised people, meaning people who have, probably something like lupus or where the body is attacking itself, arthritis, are more exposed to it. People taking steroids seem to be where that's suppressing the immune response in the human body, may be at greater risk. And most importantly, the elderly. As you get into your 60s, I'm doing this from memory and I may have it wrong, but it's something like 5 or 6% mortality rate, and that goes way up if you're in your 70s or 80s or older, and get this. People with what they call comorbidities are really at risk. So as a businessman, how do you think about these things? What does that knowledge drive in your reaction to the situation? What concrete steps should I take as a business person to protect both the public and the people working for me? Again, liability flows from a foreseeable duty, which directly causes damages, foreseeability and the violation of a standard of care. So if I take reasonable precautions in line with established standards of care, say I'm in a business. Now I can go on the OSHA website and they break things down by different industries and give guidance on what you might want to do as a business in these industries to protect your people and third parties. And you can listen to the Ohio Department of Health and the Center of Disease Control. So it would seem, once you go through all of these things, which I've done and tried to digest and simplify, it would seem that people who have stores or office situations should require staff, particularly older staff, to wear gloves and masks where there is close contact with people. I understand that N95 masks are not universally acceptable, but you do the best you can. You should train your employees in best hygiene practices. Don't assume that your staff knows what to do. Sanitize your premises regularly. Require frequent hand washing and give time that people are to do this. Maybe it's during the coffee break. You got to go wash your hands. Bathrooms have to be cleaned much more frequently than they normally are. Provide readily available hand sanitizers to staff and customers. And I don't mean one bottle in the attic, but get it around your place of business so it's very easy for people to access it. If you're in a business where people are coming in and buying things like a grocery store, it's a good idea that if you can try to offer curbside delivery, that limits contacts.
Right.
And you're able to do so, and you can stagger operational hours so that you have maybe instead of having 2 shifts, you have 3, so you reduce the density of people in the office. That has been suggested.
So it sounds like for this type of business that you're explaining, that the burden is on the consumer or the individual to comply, right? So how does, and this is where I'm working through this as in my head as a business owner, that, we got to the cost benefit analysis, right? And businesses always try to streamline costs, and how much of the compliance is on the business owner, and what liability do they have if a consumer or an employee member does not comply? And
well, yesterday, for instance, we're talking about, there was a bar association meeting, and we're talking about, and one of the judges was on the call, and we were talking about the availability of masks, people coming into his courts to interact with his clerk staff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you would like to think that everybody coming in is going to be wearing a mask because that's what the governor and the health department have said that we should do, but they don't. Mm-hmm. And so should it be the court's responsibility to provide masks? And how do you buy them? How do you order them? How do you get the best deal? All of these things come into play if you're a government. Now, if you're a business, you don't want to get sued. If you're, a government employee, you're not going to get personally sued.
Right.
The county commissioners are going to have to worry about that one.
Yeah.
But if you're a business owner, you've got to do the things that you can go back and say, I took these reasonable steps, reasonableness as defined by OSHA or by the Center for Disease Control or by maybe the governor's health office and the governor's health department. And I documented that I did them. And yes, the public there's a certain amount, we talked about assumption of the risk. They are assuming some risk coming out, but it's going to be awful hard for them to point to my business as the source of the infection if I have done these reasonable things. And it makes their job of suing you a lot more difficult. Let me just touch, if I may, on what manufacturers might need to additionally think about. Again, we have this 6-foot social distancing spacing that's suggested. That's hard.
Yeah.
You're in the meatpacking industry, for instance, where people stand really close to each other, that there are high infection rates in some of the plants. They're trying to put up plastic shielding between the workers, and that's got to have some beneficial effect. And I don't know what the right answer is. It's just that make the best effort that you can based upon the information and the standards of care that have been set forth before you. I would require masks and gloves of people. And as the business owner, I would buy them, I would pay for them. Absolutely. Now, understanding that everything is not perfectly available right now. And of course, manufacturers need to disinfect between shifts. All companies, I think, where you have a cleaning service coming in to your operation or you're having parts delivered, it's not enough that you kind of get your act together within your business. You got to have some discussions with your vendors or your subcontractors too, to encourage them and require them that they're doing the things that they need to do to make people safe when they come into your operation. So just as a general rule, all businesses should educate their employees about best health practices. Try to allow some flexible work shifts, and considering allowing people to work from home. Our lawyers, as much as possible, work from home unless they have to meet people here. Try to protect the most vulnerable workers. And this is hard because, under the HIPAA rules, people have rights about the privacy of their health information. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how that's going to sort itself out. There was I think Saturday's Wall Street Journal, there was an article about what businesses may be doing to open Some of them who have the resources at the entrance to, say, a New York office building can actually have apparati, whatever the Latin plural is, that can take people's temperatures sort of en masse as they walk in the door. We've ordered temperature guns for our firm. They haven't come in yet. We're going to start using them as soon as they arrive. But protecting the most vulnerable workers is important. I'm going to talk about a court case that's just been filed in Cuyahoga County at the end in a minute here or so. But the idea is that older people are more at risk. So make an extra effort to protect your older people. And I guess that would be me too. So allow work from home, separate them. Think of, maybe they're first in line when you do get the gowns and the masks and the gloves, they get it first. But think that through. Require staff that get a cough or fever to stay home and pay them. Don't create an incentive where somebody, the average American, somebody said, only has $400 to get them through an emergency. Well, here we are in an emergency. And right. You don't want somebody in your operation, fighting through the sickness to come to work because they have to have the income and then infecting the rest of your people. So think that one through as well. Provide tissues, no touch, trash cans, use those temperature guns when they become available. Fresh air is supposed to be good. Now that the weather is warming up, open the bloody windows. You have to communicate these steps to your employees so it can be shown you're trying to train people, you're trying to educate people to take these steps. And then you need to document that communication so that if you do get sued, you say, wait a minute, these were the protocols, here's the emails that went out, here are the posters that were placed in the office of the plant, and this is what we tried to do, and these followed best practices at the time. You need to think about encouraging, and another real big issue is kids aren't in school. So what do? I mean, we have a couple of employees with kids, my daughter being one, are allowed to come to the office and keep their distance. That's not always possible, obviously. But try to be as good as you can about it, allowing sick leave. If a parent is sick and your employee is the caregiver, you got to have a little understanding and try to support them. When testing becomes available, that probably will work its way somehow, Jeff, into the standard of care. I know Abbott has that new test apparatus that allows you to swab a person, put it in the machine, and you tell within 15 minutes whether they've got it or not. So that's basically it. Now let's take a few minutes remaining and talk about what our obligations are to employees.
Sure, and just to restate the key takeaway I had from that last discussion, that last section, is there are guidelines posted. The information has been published, if you will, on how to create a safe and maintain a safe working environment. And so the burden is on the business owner to educate, and make sure they dot their I's and they cross their T's. Emails were sent, meetings were held. Are there acknowledgements required?
I don't think so, but it just becomes a question of proof. Here's the emails. I send them out to my crew. Yesterday we made one, just as I was able to see over the last couple of weeks, the practicalities of if you have clerical staff or paralegals responsible for cleaning the conference room. Sometimes they have to take a phone call, and so clients come in and it maybe was only cleaned, the previous day. So right. We made a rule that every lawyer, prior to meeting with clients, the lawyer, and it's a non-delegable duty, they can't go to the staff and say, you do it. The lawyer has to go in and clean the chairs, clean the conference table, clean the counter, clean the door handles. And it was done in an email, so I've got a record of it. And employees need to think in those terms.
Okay, no, that's good. Good to know.
So with respect to employees, what do we owe to our staffs? And we owe them a lot. So let's go back in time, maybe when our law firm started 100 years ago. We had just come off an era Teddy Roosevelt called the Progressive Era. In those days, if you were an employee and you were hurt on the job, you had to sue your boss and prove that he had done something negligent. Well, that was a tough standard. Why? Well, because the boss would hire an expert and the poor employee who probably didn't have two nickels to rub together.
Right.
It was just in a tough spot. And the country was industrializing. There were more industrial accidents. And finally, the political change occurred, and there were unemployment compensation system went into effect, and also the workers' compensation system went into effect. So what does that mean? It means now an employee only has to show, one, he was injured, and two, he was injured on the job. And he will, in pretty good order, I mean, it's not going to take 2 or 3 years that a civil litigation would take, receive compensation for his injury. He doesn't have to prove negligence. So from the employer's standpoint, he gets something too, in that he cannot be sued at what's called common law, the law we get from England. He cannot be sued at common law in civil court for anything else. That is the general rule. However, over the last century, there have been times when an employee, for instance, would say, look, what he did was so outrageous and so bad and caused a severe injury that I should be able to go in and sue him in civil court. And that notion has kind of waxed and waned over the years, and the legislature has become involved. And we have part of Article 2, Section, I think it's 35 of the Ohio Constitution, specifically addresses that when workers' compensation came in, saying that no, you shouldn't be able to go to civil court. The workers' compensation system is a good one. It's imperfect, but all of life is imperfect, and that's what we got to go with. Mm-hmm. However, there have been claims on and off over the years, and it's kind of been a ping pong ball. Sometimes the courts seem to be a little more liberal. Other times they're not as much. And currently, the rule is that if you want to sue your boss, in addition to a workers' compensation award that you have received, you have to show two tough things. One, he intended to hurt you. And two, you have to show that your injury was extremely certain, substantial. The word is substantially certain to occur. Well, you know, no boss wants to have a setup in the plant or in the office where there's some awful thing out there where you're substantially certain to hurt somebody. That's a very high bar to have to jump over. Mm-hmm. So, question, now we have this lethal, highly infectious virus that is lethal to the people with comorbidities, people who are older. So does that inject anything into the workers' comp discussion? There is an Ohio statute that says no employer shall require, permit, or suffer any employee to go or be in any employment or place of employment which is not safe. And there's another portion that says no employer shall fail to do everything reasonably necessary to protect life, health, safety, and welfare of employees. So that's on the books. And you can bet your life that there's going to be some litigation in this area. And the people who are going to be most exposed, the business, as we've already discussed, are going to be the ones that have, or have gone down the street, or to mix my metaphor, who have put their heads in the sand and sort of willfully ignored the information that is out there. So just to kind of summarize, if a business suffers an outbreak among its staff, it wants to be able to demonstrate it followed reasonable protocols to protect its people, as we've discussed. Similarly, it wants to put itself in a position that, bearing in mind the severity of the doggone virus, it has taken reasonable, well thought out, common sense safety measures to protect the public. And again, reasonableness is most easily proven by being able to show that your company was using guidelines set forth by the state or the federal government, and best practices information, again, the Ohio Department of Health, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and OSHA.
Right. I mean, with this global pandemic, the risk is extremely high, and all the messaging we're receiving from the Department of Health and the CDC and the government is that there's such a high standard of risk of transmission that the economy was shut down and there were stay-at-home orders put in place. So then how do you, that means the virus is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. So as an employer, as a business owner, how could you even go through, yes, you provide the education, you provide the tools for a safe environment, but it just seems like that's a big hurdle to get overcome, right?
Yes, it is. But, you know, it happened. I mean, the Martians have landed, you know,
right.
In Orson Welles terms, nobody expected. Well, I say that. Many of the experts did expect this, but certainly the broad populace and the politicians didn't. And it hasn't happened in 100 years, so maybe that's not so unreasonable. Now that it's here, as we strive to find the proper balance between shutting everything down, knowing that there's going to be suicides, knowing that there's going to be kids who aren't vaccinated for the measles and they're going to get that and suffer from that, knowing that elective surgeries aren't taking place and maybe there'll be cancer deaths and that. Like, where do you find the balance? And there's nobody with the right answer. These things we're working out as a culture, and but you got to be careful. I did want to mention one case that was filed, I said, in Cuyahoga County. There was an event coordinator. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but she had worked for a company up there for a dozen years. And now here comes the governor's order. And she said, well, wait a minute. This business is not an essential business. Like law firms, accounting firms, doctors' offices, hospitals were, grocery stores were essential businesses. Hers, I believe, was not. And she says, I don't want to have to come to work. And the boss pushed back, and she said, wait a minute, I have some accrued, I guess it was sick leave or something like that. Let me apply that. And apparently the boss pushed back. So she then retained a lawyer who wrote a letter to her company saying that requiring her to come to work was in violation of the Ohio stay-at-home order. And it said that, she's willing to work remotely and so forth. So initially, the company let her take her accrued sick time and applied that. And then a week or so later, she was fired or laid off, unclear to me, but because of, quote, reallocation of resources. I don't know what that, but the plaintiff brought suit through her lawyer alleging a wrongful termination as being in violation of public policy. This is the type of thing that's going to be thrown at the business community. Just reading those facts didn't seem fair, didn't seem like they were thinking that through very well, whatever business that was. But so as best we can, and we can't take perfect steps because maybe limitation of resources, maybe limitation of protective gear, just a whole lot of things. And, you know, employees, they're not entitled to perfect protection because it's not available, number one. And number two, they're entitled to make a choice. Well, am I willing to take the risk to go to the grocery store, maybe to keep coming to work every day? And we all have to make these risk assessment and try to find a balance. It's very difficult.
Right. How do we sort that out? Because if you're a business owner and you're supplying masks, you're supplying hand sanitizer, you supplied a lot of education, but an employee still feels at risk, their risk tolerance is low, their risk tolerance is extremely low, and they refuse to come to work even though legally the employer has taken all the steps. Where does that land? I mean, it's sort of an impossible situation. So if you're a restaurant
Now, many of the restaurants are trying to do takeouts. Many of them just aren't set up to do that. I don't know if you're a McDonald's franchisee, whether you're able to do that or not. But so a lot of businesses, airlines and travel and leisure have had to shut down. Well, so let's think through what's happened with their employees. They have to shut down because there's no business. Okay, so there are people go on unemployment compensation. And right now there's 30 million people in the last 3 weeks that applied for that. Right. So if you're in a situation and you've got limited resources and you've tried to accommodate your older people as much as you can, and you've let people work at home as much as you can, you've got a cash flow calculation. I mean, that's legitimate. Mm-hmm. And so, I wouldn't, if I have to lay people off, I would try to keep the older ones, because there is Title VII, which is you can be sued for age discrimination. So there's a lot of big catch-22 here. But again, I began the discussion by talking about what is reasonable.
Right.
And what all of these things are going to come down to. If a case ends up in court, a jury's going to use their common sense. That's why juries work so well, to say, well, look, that guy, when he laid off, John Doe, had lost 50% of his business, had let as many employees as he can work from home, had sheltered the older employees as best he could, but he had limited resources. He was going to be out of business in a month if he didn't try something. And what he did was reasonable in the circumstances.
Right. And even to the extent that there's documentation, say there are performance issues, or say there are, I guess this goes back to education and documentation. Those are the key takeaways I'm hearing, because, as to your example of reallocation of resources, that is hard to understand.
That's not a legal defense, but that will come up. I mean, maybe the guy, whatever company that was, will be able to show that, look, I did the best I can. I was up against it. I was going to have to shut it down in the next 3 weeks. Nobody is guaranteed a job in Ohio. In Ohio, the rule is employment at will. Your boss is free to fire somebody. You can't discriminate on the basis of age. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex or disability, of course, is the other one. But assuming that you aren't, you can fire people.
Right.
Assuming there's no union contract or employment contract. But most businesses don't have employment contracts.
So doing the calculation here, if resiliency of your business is the key, and you want employees that provide a degree of resiliency and help you perform and meet your goals, and then you have the older population that's the highest at risk, but they're the hardest to fire.
Yeah,
we're in a mess.
It's hard. It's hard, but I mean, you can't get mad at. We shouldn't get mad at each other. We should get mad at the virus and maybe the Chinese, as far as that goes. But
right.
It's just we're humans. We do the best we can. Probably a new area of law will get worked out as a result of all these interactions with the public and with employees, and there'll be new rules based upon what worked and what was fair in this awful type of situation that we're in right now.
Right. So the key takeaways I'm hearing are: do the homework, take the right precautions, educate all of your team members and customers and vendors, and document everything you can.
Document. You need to document, because if somebody makes a claim, that's what's going to save your tail.
Because there's a lot of uncertainty still, right? How this plays out. We're literally in such an ambiguous situation that's how you have to.
We don't know if warm weather is going to make this thing die down. And if it does, if the protective gear is going to be able to be here in time for the fall flare up, if this is analogous to flu. We don't know if there are sequelae, if there are follow-on problems with people who have recovered from it and then have other issues. It's just a lot we don't know.
Right. Well, Attorney Johnson, thanks so much for your time today. This has been very educational, very helpful. The audience certainly appreciates all the detailed information, and I sure they can get a hold of you if they have any follow-up questions, correct?
Johnson & Johnson in Canfield. We've been here a long time, and two kids in the business will be here a lot longer. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Congratulations once again on your 100th year anniversary coming up.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you.